Okay, so for our third portion of the lecture, we're going to study our theme for the class, the hero's journey. You might be asking, why a theme for the class? Well, with a class like this, we cover so many different types of texts from so many different cultures. And I think that's part of the fun of it, is seeing these very different, much older writings than what we're used to reading. But they can be very different, and we can get kind of lost. It's very easy, especially for me, to get very lost as we're reading these different things and how different they are. And it can be kind of hard to see the connections sometimes. And so a common theme, a very universal theme, that transcends setting and culture and applies to everything we read, can be a nice touchstone, something to root us or ground us in the common themes and common connections between the texts. And so for this particular class, I've chosen the hero's journey. So we'll take a look at a few slides here. It won't be too long, and come to understand what the hero's journey is. And as we do that, we'll talk about why I've chosen the hero's journey. We just talked about why we need a theme for the class, but why specifically the theme of the hero's journey? So this illustration gives a real clear, simple definition of the hero's journey. It's where you have a hero or a protagonist, a main character. And I'm using the term hero very generally. It'd be awkward to just keep saying hero and heroine. So the hero is the protagonist, the main character of the story. That character can be male or female. And anyone really could be the hero of the story. So don't think of that word hero as just meaning a male character when I speak about it. So the hero goes on a journey from an ordinary world or a primary world to what we call a special world or a secondary world, and goes on these steps along the way. So define the hero's journey in a little more detail, moving past the illustration. It's a term invented by the famous author Joseph Campbell. And in his book on the hero's journey, it's called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, the name of his book. He makes the argument that myths and legends from very different time periods and cultures have much in common. So you can take lots of different stories. You can take Gilgamesh with a clear hero that we're reading first. You can then look at, say, for instance, the heroes from Greek and Roman times, like Achilles and Odysseus and Aeneas, who we'll read later in the quarter. You can even take someone like Jacob from the Bible, or you can jump way ahead to the present day and take Spider-Man, for instance. And he's making the argument that all of these characters go on a similar type of journey. And so even though we see very different cultures from very different time periods, all human beings have some universal things in common. There's a universal human connection. And the hero's journey, that journey reveals some of those basic human things, human qualities we all share. So just what are some more things kind of implied by this? Well, let's elaborate on, unpack what I just said. One other author, who is the author of the article I assigned, which is kind of like a summary of the hero's journey. I didn't want you to have to read the whole book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, because that would just take too much time. So I gave you a short article that was a good summary of it. And the author of that article says, the hero's journey is an all-embracing metaphor for the deep journey of inner transformation that heroes in every time and place seem to share, a path that leads them through great movements of separation, descent, ordeal, and return. So what he means here, Vogler, is that the hero's journey is not just literal. The hero may go on a physical journey like in Gilgamesh, but what happens on that journey is they change and grow and develop as a character. So the physical journey is almost like a metaphor for the inner journey or transformation that takes place. And he says this happens in every time and place, which goes back to Campbell's idea of the hero with 1,000 faces, that this inner journey the hero experienced is something people from all places and cultures and times share. And kind of the steps of that journey are separation, descent, ordeal, and return. Campbell divides the hero's journey into, I think, about 12 steps, and so Vogler here is kind of combining some of those steps to show a more simplified process: separation, descent, ordeal, and return. So what we conclude from all of this is that heroes are protagonists in stories from different time periods and cultures go on journeys that have similar physical, psychological, and spiritual steps. So the physical journey, the psychological changes, and the spiritual growth in the process of this both outer and inner journey is what is shared in the stories of cultures all throughout the world. So why the hero's journey, right? We need a theme, but why this theme? Well, if we go back to the course description from the first part of the lecture, we're studying the confluence or the combination, the synthesis, the mixing of ancient cultures. This, in other words, the similarities and differences they share with each other, as well as our world today. So as we look at Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Hebrew and Greek and Roman literature, and even Indian and Chinese literature a little bit, we'll see how these cultures of the ancient world, while very different in many ways, also had things in common. And I want this to be relevant to us today. How do the things these characters, these struggles these characters go through and the things they learn, how do those apply to us today? How can we learn from them today? This is a literature class, and you might ask, why study literature? That's the wonder and the joy of reading and studying literature. Fiction can actually teach us much more about the world than nonfiction can. Because there's stories about human characters going through human struggles. So the hero's journey is kind of like our way into doing that, because it's something everyone shares. It's a story, a journey about being human and what it means to be human. Okay. And so the last point I want to make here before we move on is the idea of the character arc. You saw that illustration, those two circles. Arc is a term that's often used to describe the changes a character goes through in a story. They have an arc or a shape. So they start out at one point and they're at a very different point by the end of the story. They're not a static character. A static character is a character who doesn't change at all, who doesn't learn and grow. But characters with arcs learn and grow. And the hero's journey is all about how a character learns and grows. So, with all of this in mind, hopefully you understand what the hero's journey is, but now we have to unpack the specific steps of it. As I said, this journey that's both physical or outer as well as interior, it goes through a number of steps. And so I want to take you through those steps now. And I said this can apply to any text, to Gilgamesh, to the Iliad, to texts we aren't reading in class, take a modern character, take Harry Potter, take Wolverine, if you will. I think we can see elements of the hero's journey in their character arcs. So, to take you through the steps in specific detail, I want to use a very familiar example, something much more familiar to you than, say, Gilgamesh, that will hopefully resonate with you. So one of the most beloved stories of our lifetimes is the Star Wars saga, and George Lucas explicitly stated that he used Campbell's hero's journey when plotting out the story of Luke Skywalker. And so probably I think almost everyone is familiar with Luke Skywalker's story. So I want to just take a few minutes here and show you the steps of the hero's journey using Luke as the example. If you think back to that very first Star Wars movie, Luke begins in a very ordinary world. He's a farmer on a desert planet. It's not an exciting life, it's dull. And so in the hero's journey, the protagonist always begins the story in some very ordinary place. Next is the call to adventure. So something happens. Something disrupts or interrupts that character, that protagonist's ordinary life. And so in Star Wars, we see Luke, buys these droids to work on his farm, an ordinary thing that's part of his ordinary farming life. But one of those droids carries a secret message from Princess Leia, and she's been captured, as this illustration shows, on a dangerous mission. So that's the call to adventure. Something out of the ordinary breaks through into that ordinary world and offers an irresistible call that the protagonist can't ignore, that could carry them away to something very different from their ordinary world. Then you have oftentimes the refusal of the call. They don't just immediately jump off onto their journey, onto the adventure. Sometimes they refuse it at first because it's very different from their ordinary world. And another step is the meeting of the mentor. So what pushes them on that journey? What gets them to eventually accept the call? Usually, not always, but often some kind of older, wiser figure that can help them develop and learn the special things about them that make them qualified to go on to this adventure. And so I should have said there on that last slide, obviously in Star Wars, Luke meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's just such a clear example of a mentor. So next up is crossing the threshold. You have the hero in the ordinary world, you have the call to adventure, you have the initial refusal of the call, you have the mentor that kind of helps guide the protagonist to accept the call. Then this is a very important step, crossing the threshold. I love that name. This is where the hero goes on the call to adventure. So he or she or whomever goes from the ordinary world into the special or secondary world. They cross the threshold into that other, much more exciting world. And so what happens when they're in that other world? Well, that's where they have all of the adventures. They face tests or challenges. They make allies. They have enemies they have to fight. So clearly this all happens to Luke, right? When he steps onto that Millennium Falcon after meeting Han and leaves tattooing, he has crossed the threshold. He's moved from the dry, boring farm life on the desert planet into outer space, where he'll face all kinds of tests and challenges and adventures. So, of course, Han and Chewie and the droids and eventually Leia are his allies. And, of course, he faced all kinds of tests, battling enemies like stormtroopers and certainly eventually Darth Vader. But as we talk about Vader, we'll move into more of the steps. So to kind of recap so far, you have a hero with maybe some special qualities, trapped in an ordinary world, a call to adventure, eventually accepting that call, crossing a threshold, and then facing tests, making allies, and fighting enemies once he's in that other world. Now, there's a lot of steps here, and so not every example of the hero's journey is going to have all of these steps, but almost any story about a hero you can find has at least some of the steps. And so some of these next ones I'm going to go through are maybe not in every example you see, but they're in Star Wars, and probably a lot of the examples you do see, because, like I said, Lucas really embraced and overtly stated that he used the hero's journey. And so the approach to the inmost cave is a part where the hero kind of has to struggle through who they are. They face some tests, challenges, and enemies, and they may not have won. They may not have been successful. And so they have to kind of look into themselves and see who they are and see if they can complete this journey, complete their goal, because they weren't initially successful. And so oftentimes that inner reflection after initial failure that helps propel them to eventual success happens in some kind of secluded area where they're by themselves, which is the inmost cave. And so here we have Luke, his first battle with Vader at the end of Empire, the second film, where he loses the battle, loses his hand, and loses perhaps his grip on his identity, who he thought he was, because he learns that Vader, his arch enemy, is actually his father, in one of the biggest twists of cinematic history. So, where does he go? He goes to Dagobah to study with Yoda, another mentor, which is so clearly a cave type of place. And so it's kind of a pause in the adventure after initial failure to learn more about one. The ordeal is what leads the hero to that cave. And so he often has some kind of major struggle. And here we have that visual representation of Luke losing his hand. And this is a great example of how the hero's journey is both inner and outer, because the outer, the physical torment, is losing his hand. But his inner torment, learning that Vader is his father, is almost, well, it's actually, I would argue, more painful, but is represented physically by losing his hand. If Luke came out of this battle unscathed, but still learned that Vader was his father, it would be kind of a letdown. Seeing him lose his hand and seeing that physical torment and anguish helps us as the audience better see the inner turmoil and anguish with which he's also going through. So, you have this kind of failure here represented by losing the hand and the revelation of the knowledge that Vader is his father. And you have the time in the cave where he can kind of like learn and grow and get better and perhaps be ready to do better the next time he faced the tests and challenges. So what do we call that kind of re-entry into the battle? We call it the reward or seizing the sword. Why a reward? Well, just like with losing the hand, you need some kind of physical representation to illustrate what's going on inside. And so at the start of the next movie, Return of the Jedi, Luke is completely different. At the end of Empire, he's beaten and battered and emotionally drained and has lost his hand and is tormented. But at the start of the next movie, he seems very confident, and he's come up with this incredibly clever plan to rescue his friend Han Solo. And so he's clearly gone through some growth and some change while he was inside that cave, learning more from Yoda in between the two movies. And so we need, like losing the hand, we need some kind of physical representation to show that. So what do we have? He lost his lightsaber when battling Vader. That's another important part of his ordeal. He is now fully trained as a Jedi, and he has built his own lightsaber. And so you have this beautiful moment, just like the moment where he loses his hand and it shows us so much about what he's going through. You have that juxtaposed with this moment where this is a long setup. It's a very long, slow scene with Jabba the Hutt. And then finally, he's ready to reveal his plan. And R2-D2 throws the lightsaber up in the air he's been concealing. He grabs it, and it's this new powerful lightsaber he's built, and he's able to shred all of these enemies, all of Jabba the Hutt's allies, and rescue Han Solo. And so the reward, which oftentimes is a sword or a similar symbol, is a representation of what the hero has achieved, how the hero has learned and grown in the cave since facing the ordeal. And one thing I should mention, it's really important, I haven't mentioned yet, is oftentimes the hero's failure during the ordeal is their own fault. For instance, in Empire, Luke is initially training with Yoda, but he leaves, Vader setting a trap for him. He knows his friends are in danger, and Vader wants to use the threat to his friends to lure Luke into this trap. And he knows that Luke is a little impatient and not always making the wisest decisions, rash, quick to make decisions. And so he uses that against Luke to lure him into this trap, and Luke fails. He nearly dies. So if he had listened to Yoda and stayed, he might have been better prepared. His friends might have died. But the idea there is he's prideful. He's not willing to listen to the mentor when both Oda and the ghost of Obi-Wan are telling him to stay. And so he's sort of the source of his own downfall, even though it comes at the hands of an enemy, which means he's a flawed character. He's very human. He's not perfect. So he has to learn and grow. And that's why we know that in between the two movies, he's gone back and studied with Yoda more and taken the time, put in the time he needed to grow and become a better Jedi instead of just immediately rushing off to fight Jabba and rescue Han. And so you have, like, again, the inner and the outer. The sword represents the outer change, but what we see there is the inner growth, being more willing to listen to his mentors than he was when he ran off to Cloud City to fight Vader. So the road back, he eventually has to go back to the primary world at the end of the story after crossing the threshold before. The hero returns to the primary world a changed individual, not the same person they were before. That's the point. And the reason I have a picture of Luke and Vader there is an important step, not always, but in some of these stories, is the resurrection or the atonement with the Father. So there's some kind of reconciliation that happens. That's an important part of the character's growth. So to give the example, in Jedi, Luke, he's clearly a changed man at the beginning of the movie and much improved. But the story's not done. He faces Vader again and wins, and faces the Emperor. But the Emperor could defeat him. But his father, Vader, changes and rescues him from the Emperor. And so the two are reconciled. And so there's often some kind of father figure, some kind of authority with which the hero is in disagreement, and they have to be reconciled. Even if it's not a literal father, it's some kind of authority figure that the metaphor of a father represents. So finally, return with the elixir. The hero gets back to the primary world, has learned and grown and changed. He has the sword or the elixir, the reward. So he doesn't go back to the regular world as the same person. And we see that at the end of Return of the Jedi, where the Empire has been defeated by the rebels. And it seems like, until the next movie, things are going to be back to normal for a little while. So those are the steps of the hero's journey. My goal is not necessarily for you to look at every story we read and to apply all 12 steps of the hero's journey, but to think about kind of the big steps. A hero leaving an ordinary world, facing challenges, initially failing, learning and growing, eventually succeeding and returning to the regular world a changed person. Those are the steps, and almost every story has those steps. And so they'll help us understand how ancient cultures, despite their seeming differences, do converge. And so we'll use them to a degree, and I'll often pose questions about them, and hopefully they'll help you think through these stories and come to appreciate the stories.